Hello, welcome to our channel. I'm speaking with Dr. Kjetil Tronvoll, who is the Senior Research Director of Peace and Conflict Studies at Bjørknes University in Oslo, Norway. Dr. Tronvoll was a professor of human rights at the University of Oslo until 2010, and the former co-founding partner of the International Law and Policy Institute, an international advisory company. His doctoral degree is in political anthropology from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and his research interests include societal development, governance, conflict, peace and reconciliation, and human rights issues related to the context in the Horn of Africa. He spent several years in Eritrea after independence and Ethiopia conducting field research in Tigray during the 1998 border war. And his experience has led him to study systems of authority and government in other places, including Zanzibar and Tanzania. His publications include Brothers at War, Making Sense of the Eritrean-Ethiopian War, War and the Politics of Identity in Ethiopia, and the African Garrison State, the Human Rights and Political Development in Eritrea. I'm pleased to have Dr. Tronvoll on the channel. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
So Eritrea Focus, in collaboration with Oslo Analytica, recently published its initial 255-page report about the war in Tigray, compiling evidence and sources to document the timeline of the conflict since it began in November 2020 until June 2021. You wrote in the preface that the three goals of the report were to support international governing bodies in conflict resolution and mediation by providing context to the crisis, alleviate the plight of the citizens in the Horn of Africa, and to expose the impunities of criminal behavior committed by all relevant political actors in the conflict. Can you provide a brief overview of the methodology of your research and how you came to your findings? How did you conduct your investigation?
For that specific report or in general?
Yes, for that particular report. And you could also answer to the general question of how do you conduct your research?
I think, that report is the initiative of Eritrea Focus, a humanitarian NGO, CSO, based in UK, while also Oslo Analytica supported in principle the work. We think it is of utmost importance that the current situation, not only in Tigray, but in Ethiopia and particularly in Eritrea, should be analyzed as comprehensively as possible by as many people as possible to gather the best possible empirical basis to draw our understandings from. That report is authored by a team of experts from the region, as well as some internationals. And I think the composition of that team is probably one of the best we have seen in recent kind of joint publications on the situation in Tigray, Ethiopia, Eritrea. Because we, by putting together a diverse team of experts, locals, internationals from various disciplinary backgrounds and variously positioned people, the importance also to include the Eritrean voices directly, so to say, and the experts from Eritrean studies into this makes it broader, more representatives. It fleshes out the context of this conflict, which primarily have been studied from the Tigrayan Ethiopian viewpoint, so to say. Hence the importance to support an initiative which also includes and broadens the Eritrean viewpoints on the situation. This report is just, and as it is said in the preface, it's the first of a series of studies into this situation. And I think we do have what is called kind of urgent research ongoing as the war unfolds in order to try to understand that situation and to help international actors and national local actors in operating in this very confusing terrain, created by the war. But this situation will necessitate further studies in the years to come to really unpack the background to the conflict, the triggering factors to the conflict, and of course the impact of the conflict on the ground. So this is, just a small contribution in ongoing work, which will take years to cover. I think, as you point out, George, the methodology in doing this kind of action research or urgent research, as it is called, is quite a challenge, in particular since it is a war and we don't have direct personal access to the field while the war is ongoing, both because of the blocking from the Ethiopian side on giving permissions and access, not only to researchers but to journalists, to diplomats, to humanitarian aid workers. Everyone has a problem to enter Tigray, but also, of course, for the physical challenges themselves. So we need to be careful in both the data collection and the necessity to triangulate the data, that you cannot rely on one source alone. You need to get as many sources and differently positioned sources as possible to then put together the best possible understanding of the situation on the ground. Personally, I rely on a number of sources, be that formal authorities like the leadership of TDF I speak to regularly. I speak to a lot of other Ethiopians, Tigrayans, Ethiopians from all walks of life, colleagues and other friends, journalists, diplomats, obviously, also Ethiopian authority people I am in touch with, in order to try to patch together then the best possible representation of the situation on the ground. I'm very much an empirical based researcher. I have been living and working in Tigray for many years. My first entry in Tigray was in 1991, and I think I'm pretty familiar with the terrain, both the geographical terrain, but also the ethnographical terrain, which makes it possibly easier for me to reflect the data I collect now back to the ground. I understand how the geography of Tigray influences a war strategy. I understand how the sentiment among the different people of Tigray also reflects a war strategy. And certainly also on the Eritrean side. I've been living in Eritrea also for a number of years. So that is obviously a great help for me now when I am prevented to be in the field directly. But as you know, I was there a number of times last year, the latest in September last year. So I'm pretty much updated on that sentiment too. But yes, we need to be careful in order to make sure that that we do have verified data before we draw our conclusions.
Could you speak on the difficulties of covering the conflict in the midst of the telecommunications blackout and the lack of extensive media coverage? And what challenges have you had in trying to verify the information that you receive?
Yes, it's certainly in periods of media blackout, that is the most challenging part, obviously, to get in contact with people on the ground. Now the leadership positions in TDF, the elected government of Tigray, well, they do have satellite phones, so that's, you can talk to them throughout the blackout. But information then are filtered out through various other means, by journalists who have actually been visiting, by humanitarian aid workers, by UN officials, by diplomats, and also, of course, by people in the field who managed to get out of the blackout area, so to say, either refugees, IDPs, or traders, or whatever else, who communicate back to their families or to friends and so on. So you can manage to piece together that jigsaw puzzle. But it takes time, and it is more complicated, obviously, when it is a media blackout, as we do see in periods during this war.
The report states that part of the target audience includes senior foreign affairs representatives of various Western governments and international institutions. Should you receive correspondence from the international community about this report that could help shed some light about the conflict, what are some of the points that you would want to stress in detail about the severity of what's happening today in Tigray?
Well, there is a number of extremely pertinent and urgent issues which need to be tackled in the situation in Tigray. And well, broadly speaking, they can be divided in two. You have the military situation, and then you have the humanitarian situation. Both of them are dire, are extreme and ongoing. And they are obviously interlinked. You cannot get a full, well, it's difficult to achieve a full humanitarian access to the famine-struck population in Tigray as long as the war is ongoing. And that was possibly used as an excuse earlier that the war restricted the humanitarian easement and access. Today, after the fall of Mekele, it might be a bit the other way around, because we do see immediately when the Ethiopian forces pulled out of Tigray, they at the same time cordoned off and blocked also the minimal humanitarian supplies to the people. Very, very little is trickling through today. Just received news about, some few trucks managed to reach Mekele the other day, and that's about it. So today, actually, the extreme dire humanitarian situation in Tigray is driving the war, in the sense that the Tigray government and TDF has said quite clearly that they cannot sit and wait for the Ethiopian government to come to their senses, so to say, to open up humanitarian access. They need to carve out that access themselves by force. So they have kind of an urgent offensive to try to pacify the adversary as they see it, and also to try to establish supply lines possibly into Tigray, because the supply situation through Addis Ababa has glaringly, obviously, been flawed and is faltering because of the politicized context in Addis.
How much do you rely on sources such as UNHCR, Doctors Without Borders, World Food Program, on their information when they report on the severity of the dire humanitarian need, as you said? Do you take these quantitative figures into account when trying to assess the severity of the situation?
Obviously, we need to take that into account. They do have field monitors reporting. So the numbers from the agencies you mentioned, that is probably, and USAID is probably the best numbers we do have to go by, because they do have teams in Tigray making humanitarian assessments throughout. It's not possible for them to go all over the region, but they are in various locations, and they speak again to the local people who can report also from the areas which are inaccessible. So definitely the most verifiable or the most authoritative numbers comes from those agencies. Although we also need to triangulate them, because they do report a bit differently, as you know, about the impact of the humanitarian situation. But generally, it is as best as it gets, so to say. Obviously, the numbers and the statistics, the quantitative reporting emanating from Addis Ababa has proven over and over again to be basically falsehoods and not reliable.
Well, I also want to focus on you in particular, because in your role as an academic, you're Norwegian by nationality, and the Nobel Institute is based in Oslo. You recently wrote an opinion piece in The Guardian calling for the committee to resign in protest over the atrocities committed in Tigray, to show a refusal of validation and legitimization of their decision to choose Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed to be the recipient of the 2019 Nobel Peace Prize. Other journalists and activists have called for the outright revocation of the prize. Do you think awarding the Nobel Peace Prize caused Prime Minister Ahmed to become out of touch with the political reality of Ethiopia?
I think he was out of touch with the reality before he received the award, but it boosted his position, so to say. It gave him, in his own views and also the international community's views, the kind of the moral authority to continue along the line he wanted, disregarding the diversity of opinions within Ethiopia and disregarding even, segments within his own government party who resisted the changes he wanted to do. And I'm not talking about the general liberal reforms. That has broad-based support in Ethiopia in all quarters. I'm talking about changing the EPRDF into Prosperity Party and, adopting a much more centralized nationalistic discourse at cost of the multinational federal system and discourse. So it's quite clear that the Nobel Peace Prize was a key instrument, so to say, giving Abiy Ahmed the perception of international support behind his decision to go ahead to dismantle EPRDF and establish Prosperity Party. He did that 3 days after he came from Oslo, after receiving the award, and also to kind of continue or even deepen that nationalistic discourse which have driven him since then, and which also led to the outbreak of war in Ethiopia. So it is a tragedy, and it's a very unfortunate connection, yes, between the Nobel Peace Prize and the war itself.
What are your thoughts on the fact that the prize was not awarded jointly with the Eritrean president Isaias Afwerki? Should his human rights violations been a warning to the Nobel Peace Prize Committee to reconsider awarding the prize?
No, I supported that. I have to make it quite clear that I have said over and over again that what Abiy Ahmed did from April 2018 to December 2018, that deserves a Nobel Peace Prize, the way he opened up society, so to say, and institution, and started to implement the reforms, and also started diplomatic dialogue with Asmara. Fair enough. All of that is okay. But the Nobel Peace Prize Committee drew their conclusion first in late September 2020 on who should receive the prize. And by that time, we had very clear, not only indications, but very clear empirical evidence that both the so-called peace process with Eritrea had stalled and reversed, and also the reforms internally in Ethiopia had stopped and were starting to backslide with new arrest of journalists and so on and so forth. So my criticism is that the prize committee should have done a much more comprehensive risk assessment before awarding the prize, that this was a wrong time. It was way too early or totally wrong whatsoever. But not granting it to Isaias, I supported very well, and I understand very well, because that would basically tarnish the prize from day one. You don't reward one of the world's most authoritarian and human rights abusing head of state ever with the Nobel Peace Prize, whatever what he's doing in the aftermath, in my view. So that was impossible for the committee to include him, even though he was a so-called partner in the peace process, which was never a peace process, as we know. But that would have made the prize, would have delegitimized the prize from the very start. So I think at least the committee considered that as relevant.
In your view, was the prize meant to encourage Prime Minister Abiy to assure the peace deal would manifest in the region to deliver tangible reform after the acceptance of the Border Commission's findings?
Well, the committee, the chair of the committee, she gave to, you know, she explained the prize in a way that this is a prize to support an ongoing process, to give an ongoing process a moral boost of the Nobel Peace Prize, which is, you know, fair and well. That has been done earlier also. You have two categories of prize. One which is supporting to enhance and push forward an ongoing process. The second category is, you know, for past achievements, so to say, that a process has concluded or an event has concluded. But, you know, to give a prize to an ongoing process is always a risk, is always a gamble. And the committee is very well aware of that. Also, that has been explained by the chair. But the point is that, yes, I understand that risk has to be taken. But when it is so many red flags, as we saw in September 2019, the risk was way too high. So I don't accept that excuse that risk has to be taken to support the process. Well, the process had already stalled. It wasn't a support to the process. And already at that time, I wrote that that prize would probably have a negative effect on the peace process itself. So it's quite, in my view, quite clearly the wrong prize to give at the wrong time. Yeah?
Maybe not to excuse the Tigrayan position, I can't speak on their behalf, but to explain it in a certain way. Was the peace deal that was signed in 2018 an indication that the beginning of this war was imminent, in the sense that the TPLF was not involved in the so-called delineation after Abiy became the prime minister?
I think that is also quite clear now, particularly in the aftermath. But we saw it already very early on. Exactly the language used by President Isaias Afwerki when he finally acknowledged the peace offer given by Abiy Ahmed 2 months after Abiy stated it the first time. President Isaias Afwerki publicly acknowledged it on 21st of June 2018, on Martyrs' Day, Eritreans' Martyrs' Day. And the language he used in his speech there clearly indicates that he saw this not as a process of establishing peace and brotherly relations with the Ethiopian Tigrayan people, the Tigrayan being the neighboring people to Eritrea, but as a continuation of his endless war against TPLF and Tigray. The use of the game over language, the use of kind of highlighting the enmity to TPLF, and very early on thereafter, we saw that manifesting itself in concrete strategies on the ground, you know. So it's quite clear that at least President Isaias Afwerki saw the peace agreement as a way of continuing his war against TPLF and Tigray.
The concept of Medemmer, which was one of the main topics that Prime Minister Abiy cited in his Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech, was a way to ensure his citizens that a commonality or synergistic approach to solving issues would be the way to proceed in Ethiopia. It seems that he took the meaning of the word literally, or more politically, to legitimize the centralization of the government, as you say, to consolidate power. If the current federal government fiercely insists on consolidating authority and the opposing forces fiercely insist on decentralization, where does this go? It's like an unstoppable object meets an immovable force. It's very contentious.
Well, yes, and as you know, this has been the contested issue which have driven a number of wars and conflicts in Ethiopia over the last at least 50, 60 years. So it is not a new issue. It is the contested issue reflecting the way the Ethiopian empire has been established historically and how it has been manifested contemporarily. And we also have to keep in mind that the war against the Derg regime, which ended in, which started during the Haile Selassie period, during the imperial order, but then continued during the Derg military junta, against the unitary, centralized, authoritarian state of Ethiopia ended in 1991 with the coming of power of EPRDF. At that time, there were about 15 ethnic-based resistant movements in Ethiopia. You know, a dozen in addition to EPRDF. There were no pan-Ethiopian ideological nationalist movement left within the country. So the 1998 transitional charter, which again converted into the federal constitution, that in itself is the compromise. That in itself is the political compromise to keep Ethiopia together, to maintain Ethiopian state integrity, because many of the movements at that time wanted succession, or at least a couple of them. Eritrea did succeed, as you know, being part of that war theater. So by trying to establish the multinational federation, which sadly enough never have actually been implemented because the EPRDF has been a centralizing party above the state. So we really haven't seen how the multinational federal arrangement actually work in practice in Ethiopia yet, because of that centralizing political party power structure, which now again the Prosperity Party has inherited from EPRDF. So I still believe in the possibility, well, theoretical possibility, to use that term, that the multinational federal system can work in Ethiopia if it is actually properly implemented and the values enshrined in the constitutions are respected by all political parties, the liberal values in the constitution. And that is the compromise which may save Ethiopia, so to say, to keep it together. As it is today, with a political party at Arat Kilo who want to re-centralize power, when you have such strong opponents at the regional level, not only the Tigray government and TDF in Tigray, but you have OLA in Oromia and you have other forces in the south and so on, which strongly advocates a multinational federal system, or because of the current situation, probably also will advocate succession and independence. That is not reconcilable, as you say. Those two forces are not reconcilable if they don't end up with a new compromise, so to say, centering around either the current multinational federal system, or possibly, I don't think that is good enough for some of the forces fighting the center, a confederate system, possibly, to keep the Ethiopian state intact, but in another constitutional, even looser setup than we have today.
Should the federal government recognize the rights of its states or its regions to recognize Article 39, I'm sure this is a very controversial part of the Ethiopian constitution, as a fundamental mechanism for the self-autonomy of each of the regions?
Well, so as of today, the Ethiopian constitution still stands, and Article 9 still stands as a constitutional enshrined principle. So I really hope that the Ethiopian government still respect their own constitution, to use that term. I hope so. But of course, from a political realist perspective, I seriously doubt it. They will not respect the right to implement Article 39, including succession. As the situation is now, I don't think necessarily that will be respected in Addis Ababa. But we have to wait and see, and we have to wait and see if the Tigray government will effectuate Article 39. That's still a bit early maybe to say, although there are clear indications that they move in that direction.
I want to read a line from Prime Minister Abiy's 2019 Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech. It reads, "The youth insist on good governance based on accountability and transparency. If we deny our youth justice, they will reject peace. To what extent has the prospect of transparency, justice, and peace in Ethiopia failed since that time?
Well, sadly enough, when he was in Oslo holding that speech, it was probably at the peak of liberalization in Ethiopia during Abiy Ahmed. Since then, it has backslided and been gradually and increasingly more and more undermined those liberal values he cherished in his Nobel Peace Prize speech. Today, we know that there are thousands upon thousands of political prisoners in Ethiopia. Ethiopia is now peaking again of arrest of journalists, probably the country in the world who have arrested most journalists in 2021 is Ethiopia. Also acknowledged by the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission in their statement of yesterday or day before yesterday, wasn't it? They have arrested the key political opposition leadership. They have arrested thousands of opposition members. They have arrested tens of thousands or detained tens of thousands of Tigray just because they are of an ethnicity. The central government finds collectively suspicious. So it's impossible to talk about transparency, respect of human rights, liberal reforms, that those promises given by Abiy Ahmed in his Nobel speech is implemented today. It is far, far from it. It might be that this is a kind of extreme consequence of the ongoing war in Tigray and in Wollega, in Oromia, the insurgency there. But so we will have to wait and see if it is kind of a long-term trend, that it is a reauthorization, of Ethiopia, of Ethiopian politics, or if it will open up a bit again after this war, so to say, whenever that is a solution to that has been reached. But I seriously doubt that we will see in the near future a new liberalization of Ethiopian society. There are no indications of that, at least as we can see of today. Also reflecting the election results which just have been released. It's clearly an entrenchment of a one-party state mentality, and which again, Prosperity Party is EPRDF in a new wrapping. It's basically it's nothing more fundamentally new to Prosperity Party as we have seen earlier in Ethiopia. The only thing is the 10-month exception of 2018 conditions, so to say.
Maybe to turn away from the speculative into what we do know, I want to turn to the topic of the involvement of the Eritrean troops in Tigray and the context of foreign interference. President Afwerki, if you can call him a president, almost seems to be in complete control of the military objectives when it comes to waging assault on Tigrayans in Tigray. And as a result, Tigrayan civilians, Eritrean refugees have been the primary victims of these attacks. To what extent do you hold Isaias Afwerki and the PFDJ regime accountable for starting this war? And do you think he is acting vicariously through Abiy Ahmed in his military pursuits?
I think definitely President Isaias Afwerki and the small ruling clique in Ethiopia, in Eritrea, was instrumental in advocating a war on Tigray and in influencing Abiy Ahmed in his strategies against TPLF. But obviously, the responsibility of the war rests in Addis Ababa because it's their territory, it's their country. And Addis Ababa invited Asmara to join in on the war. But I believe that President Isaias is so much more smarter and shrewder than Abiy Ahmed. So Abiy didn't really understand that he was also being played by President Isaias in all of this. Abiy is a child compared to Isaias when it comes to real politics, so to say. And Isaias Afwerki understands the Horn and understands Ethiopia much better than Abiy Ahmed does. So we also saw that now in the final phase of this phase of the war, so to say, that Isaias started to pull back his own forces and regroup and pulling them back to northern Tigray before the final offensive, so to say. As the EDF, Eritrean Defense Forces, did not come to the rescue of ENDF because they didn't want to sacrifice themselves to save some Ethiopian lives, because they have another interest, you know. They're not in it to save Ethiopia. Isaias Afwerki has a totally different agenda in this regard, which also reflects the final kind of the few weeks we have just passed with Operation Alula. The tragedy obviously is the way the regime in Eritrea once again have broken people-to-people relationship between the Eritrean and Tigrayans, between the Eritrean and Ethiopians at large, by waging this war again. We saw before the breakout of the war, I had a long-term research project in the borderlands between Tigray and Eritrea, where the civilian people on both sides were desperate in reconnecting, to re-socialize, to get together with their families and relatives on the other side, to restart trading, businesses, and so on and so forth. Now that is broken once again, and that kind of people-to-people reconciliation modus, which we saw very much alive in 2017, 2018, 2019, is now dead and pushed back again many years because of the atrocity crimes committed by Eritrean soldiers against the Tigrayan civilian population. Hopefully, it is possible to reconcile the people-to-people again in an aftermath after Isaias is gone, but it will take a considerable effort, so to say, by both sides in doing so.
It's interesting you mentioned the border communities in the conversation of how the war has affected the citizens of both countries. I don't know if this is confirmed as of the recording of this conversation, but I saw a battlefield report that the town of Badme is starting to flare up in terms of fighting. And of course, that was the site of the very bloody border conflict in 1998. Should this continue, or should these developments arise, do you think we could see the continuation of what we saw 22 years ago? Do you think the border war is starting to revive itself in this sense?
Yes and no. It is no longer a border war as such. And it never was a border war in 1998 either, in my view. It was much more politicized than that, as you know, and as I've written a book on. But it is quite clear that the Tigray government and TDF has stated that they will liberate all Tigrayan territories. And still there are Eritrean soldiers in Tigray, northern Tigray, occupying parts of undisputed Tigrayan territory. Then you do have the disputed territories. What will happen to that in the aftermath of this situation? We have to wait and see. I don't necessarily think that, I will not speculate in what will happen with that. But it is also clear that this situation will develop into a continuation of a conflict with Asmara, and possibly a war along those lines in order to change the regime in Eritrea. That is not the job of Tigray government or TDF, obviously. That is up to the Eritrean people to change their own regime. But I think as TDF leadership have expressed, that Isaias Afwerki cannot expect that he can order his army into Tigray to commit more or less genocide and then pull out with impunity. There need to be some accountability for the crimes committed in Tigray, the war crimes, the crimes against humanity, and possibly even genocidal crimes. So I think the Tigray government and the Tigray people would expect that to happen, some kind of accountability measures against Isaias and the regime in Eritrea. And to effectuate that, well, there are not that many options, so to say. So you can connect the dots.
Prime Minister Ahmed reluctantly admitted the presence of Eritrean troops in Tigray in late March of this year and excused their role as simply guarding the border areas. Of course, there are multiple reports that have shown with satellite imagery that Eritrean troops were all over the region. The Eritrean government has barely said anything about its personal role in the conflict, with one very brief and indirect admission of participation in the conflict in an address to the United Nations after the issue of starvation was brought to the Security Council in April. What could the international community do to pressure the Eritrean government to speak about their responsibility in adding fuel to the fire?
Yeah, we know that Eritrean forces were participating more or less from day one in the war on Tigray, starting with the shelling of Humera by Eritrean artillery. And then very quickly thereafter, also Eritrean troops started the fight on Salambesa front line and also crossed into Tigray. So they were part of the war they were part of the planning. Isaias was instrumental in planning the war. So obviously they were part of the war from the very first on. And everybody knew that, except the propaganda machinery in Addis Ababa didn't want to acknowledge it until it was blatantly obvious that they couldn't any longer get away with the narrative that the Eritrean forces are not there. Since then, the Ethiopian government and the Ethiopian government spokespersons, be that Abiy Ahmed himself, Redwan Hussein, Bilene, Demeke for that matter, has repeatedly self-incriminated themselves by kind of trying to explain the war, but and then offering intent of actually civilian massacres and civilian targets, incriminating themselves in conducting war crimes and crimes against humanity. Isaias Afwerki is much smarter, as I've said. He has not said anything. So at least he hasn't self-incriminated, hasn't incriminated himself or any other spokespersons on the Eritrean side, just keeping quiet, not mentioning it, not discussing it. So in the long-term strategy, that is wise, in a sense, a juridical wise, you can say. It's much harder to pin the concept of intent of genocide on the Eritrean regime than it is on the Ethiopian regime in this war. I think that the international community, and that has been proven over and over and over again for 30 years, that Isaias Afwerki doesn't cave in easily to international pressure. He hardly caves in at all, but he is a pragmatist, an extreme pragmatist, and his main concern is to survive himself politically. So if he is sufficiently cornered by a joint international community standing together, he is maneuvering and can be pushed, so to say. He finds a foxhole and sneaks out that way. But today, the international community is not united on the situation in Tigray or on the situation versus Eritrea, because Russia, China have very different interests than US in that situation, or the West for that matter, is also divided. So we will never get that sufficiently coordinated, united pressure to imposed on President Isaias Afwerki to corner him. He is maneuvering, he is trying to establish new alliances, he's playing with his old friends and trying to get new friends and so on and so forth. So I don't think, actually I think it is very little we can do in order to get him to a negotiation table, so to say, or to really face up, or to really man up and face the consequences of his actions. Other than by arms. That's the only language Isaias Afwerki knows is war.
There has been absolutely no coverage in Eritrea about what's happening in Tigray for the past 8 months.
Mm.
We, of course, know the reasons why that is,
Mm.
but could you reflect on the frustration you might feel when having to consistently debunk misinformation from the Eritrean government and their
Mm.
supporters?
Mm. Yes, there are very little knowledge inside Eritrea or information spread inside Eritrea on the situation. But there is even more, coordinated effort by the Eritrean troll factories and Eritrean nationalist actors in diaspora, both online and in reality, so to say, trying to spread the disinformation, lies, propaganda, and also trying to undermine the legitimacy of the facts, and also to delegitimize and attack people who are trying to present a more empirical based narrative analysis of the situation, myself included for that matter. That's just how the situation is. The war is fought on the battlefields in Tigray, but certainly the war is also fought on social media by actors from both Eritrea and Ethiopia, and Tigray for that matter. Now, it has been rather comprehensive research analysis of social media activists, which clearly tells us that Ethiopian government social media related activists and Eritrean government related social media activists, they are primarily spreading disinformation and propaganda, whilst the Tigray-related social media activists are not deliberately spreading false information, but at times they do send out misinformation, not the disinformation as it is called. But they are much more empirically based, reflecting the reality, and that's a rather comprehensive research project, also published here, and some of those findings were published in Washington Post, the monkey cage reporting there. So I think that is also rather clear, that you see which side is very consciously, deliberately spreading falsehood and lies and propaganda, and which one is not. And you also have to remember that the Tigray regional government and TDF, they have hardly been present as such in the mass information, so to say, basically because they have been preoccupied fighting a war, and there has been a media blackout. So there has been relatively little information, official propaganda coming out from TDF and Tigray regional government in all of this.
Dr. Tronvoll, this may be a difficult question to answer. Do you think, as a foreign researcher with particular experience in Tigray and personal connections to TPLF and TDF leadership, that you have a responsibility to communicate in an objective manner to Tigrayans the circumstances of Eritrean troop involvement in Tigray, not to excuse their actions, but to explain the very serious human rights violations in the national service that has taken place for decades?
Yes, and I've done that on many occasions. That I definitely not excuse any of the terrible crimes and atrocities committed by Eritrean forces in Tigray, but I have been trying to explain why or how come they can do this, in the sense that I believe that the normative moral fabric of Eritrean society has totally been broken down by Isaias Afwerki, both individual and collective moral fabric of Eritrean society, where the Eritreans are arrested and tortured and killed and raped by their own for 2 decades, which have impacted that collective mentality, which might explain the atrocities they themselves commit on the Tigaro in Tigray. It doesn't excuse it, not at all. They individually have to be held responsible, and their chain of command has to be held responsible for these crimes. But and that's the extreme sad and disheartening situation here. These are civilian Eritreans who have been caught up in national service maybe for 20 years. I know villagers from the village I did fieldwork in 91 to 93 in Highland Eritrea, who were recruited in 1998 to fight in the border war, who are still in the army. Over 20 years there. You know, it's a terrible situation for these farmers, you know, ordinary Eritreans who cannot get out of that system and who are then forced to fight a new war on behalf of their erratic president, so to say. So I think, and again, as I said, I really hope I know that the Eritrean and Tigrayan communities have an extremely high capacity to reconcile after conflict, historically and contemporarily. I really hope that after this situation has settled, the dust has settled, that both traditional mechanisms of reconciliations and newer theories of it need to be employed to again restore the social ties, the cultural ties, the economic ties between these two people.
Thank you for your answer. I wanted to ask, just because I think we're seeing an alarming rise in the hate and rhetoric between the two peoples. Having said that, and also going back to what you previously mentioned about Isaias responding to war as a means to stave off his competition, from your perspective or from your understanding of what's happening, do you think a military confrontation is even a feasible option at this point?
With
Isaias, yeah.
I'm not going to speculate in that, in a sense. I think it is a plausible scenario, to use that term, and we have to wait and see how it develops. Again, the TDF leadership has said quite clearly that it is impossible for Tigray to live with a hostile Isaias Afwerki next door. That has to be settled one way or the other. Hopefully, you know, in an ideal world where the humanitarian principles are obeyed, the UN Security Council should make a referral of President Isaias and his regime to the ICC in The Hague. And he should be arrested and placed under investigation and accountability in an international criminal court. But I seriously doubt that will happen, because the UN Security Council is incapacitated, basically. The whole system is not functioning. So it has to be solved in a different manner. It can be some unilateral jurisdictions, as the trial in Belgium, which have just started, or the investigation under the justice system in Belgium against the war crimes in Tigray can also implicate Eritrea. But, you know, to get him arrested is a different matter. Isaias Afwerki is only traveling to his dictator comrades in the region. He doesn't travel internationally because he is exactly afraid of being picked up by some jurisdiction. So it is hard to see. It is hard to see the establishment of durable peace in the Horn of Africa as long as Isaias Afwerki is in Asmara. Well, he's getting old, so, you know, he's not there forever. But yeah.
What happens next? I think that's also equally a very worrying question.
What happens next post Isaias with Eritrea? Exactly, I agree. I've been trying to call for international attention on that for 15 years, actually. That the international society needs to prepare for a post Isaias Eritrea, because we might face a state collapse when you know, we don't have any functioning civil society. You don't have any functioning political institutions as parliament or you know, ministries for that matter. You do have a military structure, and you do have an inflated security structure, but that they are basically all corrupted, and they cannot, or it's difficult to see how they can shift into a more liberal modus to establish a new Eritrea, a second republic after Isaias is gone. So I'm very worried about Eritrea post-Isaias. I think it will be very difficult for the Eritrean society. Also, the fact that the Eritrean opposition is so fragmented and so at times disoriented, to use that term, and possibly also alienated from the constituencies inside Eritrea. Some of them have been in diaspora for 30 years and more. Do they really reflect the sentiment and opinions of Eritreans at home, and their aspirations and their visions and their interest in the new Eritrea? We don't really know about the ethnic or religious composition of Eritrean society today. Who is the majority, to use that term? Who shall have the biggest imprint of the Second Republic on how that state should be configured? There is a divide which President Isaias have utilized to its utmost in the divide and rule policy, and the division between the Tigray highlanders and the lowlanders, the Christians and the Muslims, the minorities in the West, and so on. What is the common denominator now politically for the Eritrean people inside Eritrea? And then it's the whole question about the huge diaspora. What kind of role should they play? Should they return back home? Should they, do they have an interest in that? And so on and so forth. It is so many fundamental challenges facing Eritrean society post-Isaias that definitely everyone should be concerned about that, and some international actors should really prepare for that transition.
I would like to close by asking about the recent election that took place in Ethiopia in June 2021. Of course, the results came in, as you mentioned earlier in our conversation, as the National Election Board declared the Prosperity Party as a victor in 421 of 436 seats, which is almost 97% of the House of Representatives. And other main constituencies have not even been able to vote yet, including parts of Oromia, Harare, and Tigray. Major political opponents and activists remain imprisoned, and opposition parties have barely had any legitimacy in the federal government, all of which is happening under the backdrop of COVID-19, which was the official reason that the federal government decided to postpone the elections in 2020. Are the elections that took place really the most free and fair?
No, not at all. Not at all. You cannot use the label as it is generally used, free, fair, and credible elections at all on what has happened in Ethiopia in the electoral process, starting from day one, so to say. Yes, they did have some institutional reforms, making the election board a bit more autonomous and independent. But we also know that the election board has been under heavy political pressure and has swayed to that pressure over and over again. The process leading up to election, the voter registration process, highly manipulated and controlled, alienating segments of the population, as we know. The candidate registration process, highly manipulated and controlled, alienating a number of candidates which were prevented to register. The arrest of opposition leaders, the closing of opposition offices in the regions, the harassment, the intimidation of opposition, and so on and so forth. To sum up, it reflects a badly organized EPRDF election. You can say one thing about EPRDF: they didn't manage. They knew how to organize logistics. This time around, they haven't even managed that. But the substance, that this has not been an open, transparent, plural election, is there. Yes, you have had opposition parties competing. Well, you have had opposition parties competing in every election in Ethiopia since 1995. That's nothing new. In 2000, you had 11 members in opposition. You have 11 members of opposition elected into the House of Representatives. Now it is 15 or 16. It's more or less the same results as the second election they did have in that regard. In 2005, you had almost 30% of the seats in the House were opposition members. That is the most genuine democratic election they did have, as such, you know. So it is much more continuities of EPRDF practices we see than there are changes. Yes, there are some changes. I recognize that. But the substance is still the workings of a one-party state. And the outcome reflects that too.
What should observers to the election expect to see in the coming weeks and months ahead of further results? Should they anticipate the government reinstall Abiy as the rightful elected leader, or should they expect more resentment throughout the other constituencies? What should international observers look to see?
Well, if election is conducted in the remaining about 100 constituencies, I don't think we can, you know, I think it is extremely doubtful that elections will be held in Tigray. So there are the other few constituencies which were postponed due to logistics and due to insurgencies, which might be conducted later on in the fall. We cannot expect any other results outcome of that than what have we seen so far. That people will take the absolute majority, 95% or so of them. And of course, the new House of Representatives, which will have its first sitting in September, will obviously, well, as far as we know now, re-elect the current chairman of the party as prime minister. The only thing which makes, you know, Ethiopian politics, party politics, interesting is going forward is the deep schism within Prosperity Party, how that will play out and impact government and politics. The deep schism is obviously between Amhara PP and Oromo PP, or between fractions of Amhara PP and fractions of Oromo PP, and also between Southern Nations and Nationalities and Peoples Regions PP, or Sidama PP, and the center. And where you do have representatives within the Prosperity Party advocating for a multinational federal order. Of course, most of them have been cleansed out and changed. That was the old guard in the former house. The new house are majority stocked with new representatives, which we really don't know. We can suspect that they are more Abiy loyalists, hence that's why they have been nominated. And maybe that's, you know, they will not defend necessarily the multinational federal arrangement as their predecessors did. So that is also an interesting element to look at, the change of guards within the House of Representatives, how that impacts policy formulation. So the most interesting aspects of party politics in Ethiopia in the years to come are to be found within Prosperity Party, the dynamics within the party, not external to the party. Again, as I said, it's the re-entrenchment of a one-party state. And hence we have to look within the party to see possibilities of reforms or possibility of splits or changes to come.
One argument that I've read about the elections is that once Abiy is coronated, in the sense that he's given his elected position that he was looking for, because he was selected by the EPRDF coalition in 2017 to be the next prime minister after Lema was not able to fulfill that position, that he could, in a way, negotiate with the Tigrayan parties who he's currently fighting in the conflict. From the Ethiopian government's perspective, does the legitimacy of an elected position give Abiy the ability to settle in Tigray? And if that happens, would Isaias be okay with that?
Well, first of all, yes, Abiy might have legitimacy in the eyes of certain constituencies in Ethiopia. democratic legitimacy. He certainly doesn't have any democratic legitimacy in the eyes of the Tigrayan population. And I don't think he has any democratic legitimacy in the eyes of the international community. So it is a limit to that democratic legitimacy he can use to project power or to project his interests. Internally, yes, there are people who have said, just wait until after the election, he will settle the Tigray war. He has the mandate to negotiate, so to say. I think that's an utterly naive position. I think he would rather see a mandate to continue war, to strengthen the war. Based on what he has said, based on how he has acted and what he has said so far. Number two, based on the interest of other political segments of the Prosperity Party, certainly the Amhara Prosperity Party and Amhara political elites, as it is called in general, Nama, and to a certain degree Ezema, and so on, although Ezema isn't an Amhara party as such. I'm here hinting at, the status of West Tigray, that it seems to be that it is a consolidated Amhara political position, meaning both PP and opposition believe that West Tigray belongs to Amhara regional state, administratively, territorial-wise. And Abiy Ahmed has, although initially it appeared that he was hesitant to endorse that forceful annexation of West Tigray, he has now accepted it. And he has now said that ENDF will defend it from a possible TDF offensive to come. So, and we know that TDF will have no interest as of now to negotiate anything prior to liberating the territories. That, withdrawal of enemy forces, then we can negotiate. Or we need to take it back by force, as they say. So, I don't see any hope for that the election itself and its outcome will make Abiy more interested or more soft to negotiate with TDF, rather the opposite.
Is that appeasement by Abiy to the Amhara base a way to secure his voting constituency?
It was a way to secure his voting constituency. It is a way to secure his position as a party leader and as prime minister, basically. I think that he relies heavily upon the Amhara fraction of PP in order to be in position, basically.
Finally, I'll end on a funny question. How hypocritical is it for the PFDJ and the Eritrean regime supporters to cheer for the Ethiopian elections for obvious reasons? Is it a betrayal of those who fought for Eritrea's independence, or is it simply cognitive dissonance?
I'm sorry, I was laughing because it is a serious question, but it is also a very funny question because it is an extreme paradoxical, bizarre situation to read the statement, the tweets by Charlie, or listening to Eritrean PFDJ trolls claiming the Ethiopian election when they never have had. Well, they do have had one election, but when they have suspended the Eritrean constitution, and Isaias Afwerki has quite clearly stated that there will be no election as long as he is in power. So that's just hilarious, obviously, and it's just a confirmation of the total lack of integrity, total lack of principle, total lack of stature, total lack of moral authority within the Eritrean leadership, to say something like that.
Dr. Tronvoll, I'd like to give you the final word.
Well, I think we have covered quite a lot of issues. As I say to every one of my friends, both in Eritrea, Tigray, Ethiopia, wherever, that we all have to work for peace, but it is a long time struggle ahead, I think, to achieve a sustainable peace, both within Ethiopia, but also between the countries itself and in the region at large. And I think we need to be realistic about that, and have both short-term and mid-term and long-term objectives and perspectives on our work, whatever we are doing.
Dr. Tronvoll, thank you for appearing on the platform.
Thank you for inviting me.